Good evening, everyone. If I could ask you to take your seats, we'll get started. I'm Terry Gerton. I'm the president of the National Academy of Public Administration, and I want to thank all of you for joining us here tonight. We are thrilled to have such a great crowd, and we're also very excited for the program. I also want to say how pleased the Academy is to be the home of the Elliot Richardson Prize Award. Mr. Richardson personified public service. As many of you know, he served in 4 cabinet-level positions in the United States government. He was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of Commerce. He was also a Fellow of the National Academy, one of our very own. And we wholeheartedly embrace the values of integrity and public service that his life and this award represent. Tonight we are here to recognize the Honorable Sylvia Burwell and the Honorable Leon Panetta for continuing the tradition that Elliot Richardson established through their own excellence, integrity, and dedication to our government and to the people of this nation. Tonight's event is the result of many months of work and planning, and so I want to acknowledge the hard work of the board of the Elliot Richardson Prize Fund, the prize nominating committee, and the board of the National Academy of Public Administration, all of whom play an important role in preserving this legacy. Just as a quick orientation to the program this evening, we're going to begin with Mr. J.T. Smith, who is a member of the Richardson Board and the co-chair of the Richardson Nominating Committee and an Honorary Academy Fellow, who will give remarks and a tribute to Mr. Richardson. Mr. Smith will be followed by Mr. Joseph Kaspudis, who is treasurer of the Richardson Board and co-chair of the Nominating Committee, who will introduce our prize winners. And following those tributes, Mr. Michael Rogers, chairman of the Richardson Board, will award the prize to our honorees. And then our program will continue with a moderated conversation between Mr. Panetta and Dr. Burwell, led by Mr. George Will. Following those, we will have a question and answer time. We have a mic in the aisle there, and we will ask all of you to be thinking about your questions and to line up at the mic following the conversation for question and answers. Then there'll be a final presentation before we end our evening tonight. So again, I want to thank you all for coming and joining us for what promises to be a very intriguing conversation, and I'll turn the mic over to Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Terry. I had the privilege of working directly with Elliot Richardson in all 4 of his cabinet posts, and later at the Department of State when he was leading the effort to obtain a U.S. participation in a meaningful UN Law of the Sea treaty. It's hard to believe that Elliot Richardson died nearly 20 years ago. He's still a palpable presence in my memory. Shortly after his death, friends and admirers of Elliot's at the Council for Excellence in Government had the good idea to endow a prize that would honor and perpetuate his example by recognizing exceptional public servants who in long-term public service have demonstrated, and this is from the prize description, generosity of spirit, thoughtfulness in the pursuit of excellence in government, courage and integrity. The lead donors to the prize foundation were Frank Weil, who can't be here tonight, John McCumber, my friend who just celebrated a big birthday, he's in the second row, Joe Kaspudis, from whom you'll hear more in a few minutes, and the late John Whitehead and the late Richard Darman. Richard Darman, I note, was the immediate predecessor of Leon Panetta as director of the Office of Management and Budget. Additionally, Joe Kaspudis, who worked with Elliot on something called the Hitachi Foundation, persuaded the Hitachi Foundation and the Hitachi Corporation to donate liberally to the creation of the prize. I want to also recognize Elliot's son, Henry, who's in the second row, seated next to Alice Rivlin, former Elliot Richardson Prize winner. Henry is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown and an invaluable member of the nominating committee and link to his father's spirit. Napa, as Terry noted, had assumed stewardship of the prize in 2009, and for those of us who have been involved for the full 18 years the prize has existed, are just hugely grateful for the stewardship that Napa is providing. Since its first award, it has gone to 16 exceptional public servants. Among these, 4 have served as directors of OMB, 4 as members of Congress, 3 at the Department of HEW, or as it's now known, HHS, 2 as secretaries of defense, 2 as directors of the CIA, and 3 as White House Chief of Staff or Deputy Chief of Staff. As Joe Caspiutes will recount, remarkably, Leon Panetta falls in all 6 of these categories. And Sylvia Burwell, who's considerably younger and is just starting her career, has already fallen into 3 of the 6 categories. And in her 2 cabinet-level posts, she served at a younger age than Elliot did in his first 2 cabinet posts. She now serves as president of the American University, and as an aside, Elliot Richardson once had waved in front of him the prospect of being a university president. It was 1953 when James Conant was stepping down from Harvard, and an elderly, respectable judge who was active in Harvard affairs took Elliot aside and asked him whether he would have any interest in being president of Harvard at the age of 33, remarking that Elliot was just the right combination of intellectual and stuffed shirt. Richardson disavowed interest and instead embarked upon his career of extraordinary public service, and we're richer for that. Rather than recite once again Elliot's career milestones in state and federal government, I want to focus instead on a single episode and on a single one of the prize criteria that the honorees have demonstrated Elliot's generosity of spirit. That's something that isn't easy to define in 1 or 2 words. It's a little bit one of those things that you know it when you see it. And indeed, in Elliot, we saw it. At the risk of belaboring the obvious, this is an attribute, generosity of spirit, that seems to be in serious deficit in national governance at the present. Current circumstances compel recollection of the event for which Elliot is most famous, the Saturday Night Massacre. Elliot actually resented somewhat that this event overshadowed his long and more substantive endeavors in other contexts. Nonetheless, it seems timely to say a few words about how he conducted himself and the generosity of spirit he displayed in an extraordinary week in October of 1973. To set the stage, there was a distinguished lawyer acting as special prosecutor investigating possible illegal conduct and obstruction of justice by campaign staff, White House staff, and possibly the President of the United States. There was an irascible general as White House Chief of Staff, serving as a perfect instrument of the President's will. The President had persuaded himself that the special counsel was under political control of his opponents and that he was exceeding his investigative authority. Richardson, as a condition of his Senate confirmation and as part of DOJ regulations, had pledged not to dismiss the special prosecutor except for quote-unquote extraordinary impropriety. The President and his counsel were persuaded that the theory of a unitary executive empowered him to order the Attorney General to direct the special counsel to cease seeking White House evidence and to dismiss the special counsel if he did not honor this directive. Events unfolded beginning on Monday of the week before the Saturday Night Massacre. To the uninformed observer, the matter was simple. Nixon and his staff were presumed to be guilty. It was an easy choice for Richardson to resign rather than to do the president's will. Richardson, however, had an open mind about the president's motives and sought to find a constructive path forward. He was respectful of Nixon's accomplishments and intellect. At the same time, he admired Archibald Cox, his former law professor. He was conscious of the nation's interest in a sound outcome at the time of international peril with a war raging in the Middle East. Throughout the week leading up to the massacre, Richardson treated all parties with courtesy and respect. He saw himself as counsel for the situation. He was genuinely disappointed when events spun out of control. And in the course of all of this, I did not hear him disparage any of the other participants. In fact, I never heard Elliot say something uncharitable about another human being. He did tell Al Haig on the Friday before the Saturday Night Massacre that he felt he'd been treated shabbily, but true to form, an hour later, Elliot apologized, saying he had almost lost his temper. After he resigned rather than dismiss Cox, Richardson helped persuade Solicitor General Robert Bork to carry out the president's order to avert a chain of resignations at the Justice Department. In this respect, Richardson may have been generous of spirit to a fault. The dignity, fair-mindedness, and generosity of spirit that Richardson displayed in the midst of this constitutional crisis helped place into stark relief the mean-spirited behavior of the White House. In so doing, Richardson helped move the country to an acceptance of the necessity and merit of Nixon's resignation 10 months later. Richardson's courageous and dignified conduct provides a compelling example for this and future generations of public servants. Thank you.
Thank you, JT, for those remarks and tribute to Elliot Richardson, which brought in graphic form how important the characteristics are of those who receive this award and emulate his career in their own careers. It's certainly an honor for me to have this opportunity to review the amazing careers of our two awardees this evening with this audience. I think that Secretaries Panetta and Burwell are great examples of what one can do with dedication to public service, with hard work and effort, and show us how many opportunities there are for people who go into government to really make a difference to the quality of life and the policies that govern us in this country. Before I start this, I would like to add my own thanks to Terry Gerton and to the staff of NAPA for organizing this event and handling the administration throughout the year that leads up to it. We really appreciate what NAPA has done with this, and I'm so happy that the Richardson Prize has a home here. I know it has a home here for good. Let me start by saying some remarks about Secretary Burwell. For over 25 years, she served with distinction in key leadership positions in the federal government and also in major nonprofit institutions. As the 22nd Secretary of the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, from 2014 until early last year, she dealt skillfully with the challenges that office presented, which especially graphic in implementing the Affordable Care Act. This was a task of enormous proportions and complexity, carried out under demanding deadlines. She did what many thought could not be done, and accomplished this while continuously under attack from conservatives opposed to the act. Secretary Burwell also orchestrated the nation's response to the Ebola and Zika crises, expanded critical services for children and families, and provided leadership for advances in research and innovation. In her two prior positions with the Office of Management and Budget, Secretary Burwell demonstrated some unique skills that have become very scarce in Washington, but are very much needed here now. Holding the position of Director of OMB, she showed us how to shut down the federal government, having given the orders to do so in October of 2013, when Congress could not agree on a budget. However, after doing so, she came to the rescue. It is interesting to note that, by the way, one of the causes of this impasse was the desire of Republicans in Congress to defund the Affordable Care Act, which she later was responsible for implementing. But a second skill she demonstrated in this event was her role in getting the government up and running again. She was a key negotiator in reaching the budget compromise between the administration and Congress and between Republicans and Democrats that reopened the government after the shutdown. This compromise provided for 2 years of funding with the intent of avoiding another shutdown in the very near future, just as the budget legislation accomplished last week also provided for 2 years of funding. So there's a real important skill, bringing people together in a spirit of compromise and moving forward. We don't see that very much in Washington anymore, unfortunately. However, she has a third skill with regard to the budget that surpasses the two I have just described. Holding the positions of Deputy Director of OMB and then Deputy Chief of Staff to the President from 1997 to 2001, Secretary Burwell was a central figure in crafting the key policy and fiscal decisions that led to the 3 years of Clinton budget surpluses. One can only wonder if the words budget and surplus will ever be used again together when referring to federal fiscal situation. Secretary Burwell also served for 11 years at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, including roles as the Chief Operating Officer and President of its Global Development Program, focusing on agriculture, water, sanitation, hygiene, and financial services for the poor. After the Gates Foundation, she became the president of the Walmart Foundation, where she led efforts to fight hunger in America, empower women around the world, and leverage Walmart's presence to do good for millions of people in its local communities. During her tenure, the foundation's grants surpassed $1 billion. Secretary Burwell is also an excellent role model for women. She discharged her duties at OMB and at HSS with 2 young children at home. A Harvard graduate like Elliot Richardson, she was selected as a Rhodes Scholar and received a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics from the University of Oxford. Secretary Burwell now serves as American University's 15th president, a post she has held since June of last year. She is the first woman to ever fill this role. With her extensive experience in developing solutions to society's problems in the federal government and in the nonprofit sector, she brings valuable perspectives and experience to this important educational institution. The expectations are that American University will become more of a forum for discussion, debate, and research on public policy issues, while strengthening its academic programs and turning out graduates for key roles in all sectors of society. If I can interject a personal note, back in the 70s when I was a public servant, I also taught part-time at the Graduate School of Business at American University. So perhaps, Secretary Burwell, I could see you after this meeting and give you my resume. I would also like to observe that Secretary Burwell, having accomplished much in her 25-year career, is the youngest awardee to ever receive the Richardson Prize, as well as being the 4th woman to be selected for this honor. The others being Alice Rivelin, who is sitting in the 2nd row, Sandra Day O'Connor, and Sheila Bair. The Richardson Prize Board congratulates Secretary Burwell for her achievements and is pleased to award her the prize. I now will attempt to give the highlights of Leon Panetta's career, the man who fits all 6 categories that J.T. Smith listed. Leon Panetta served with distinction in 4 of the most challenging positions in the executive branch. J.T. has listed them, but I'll say them again. Secretary of Defense, Director of the CIA, Chief of Staff to the President, and Director of the Office of Management and Budget. When his tenure in those posts is combined with his 16 years in the Congress and 2 years as a U.S. Army lieutenant, it spans nearly half a century, just about 1 year short of that 50-year mark. Amazing. In several ways, Secretary Panetta's career parallels that of Elliot Richardson. Both held many important positions. Both were dedicated to public service over an extremely long period of time. Both were known for courage and integrity and were widely recognized for their effectiveness in every one of the important positions that they held. And both came under the crosshairs of President Richard Nixon when he wanted to fire somebody. J.T. Smith has already reminded us about the Richardson experience in the Saturday Night Massacre. In 1970, when Secretary Panetta was Director for Civil Rights in the Department of HEW, his zeal in applying the law to cases of school segregation caused President Nixon to direct that he be fired. The HEW Secretary at the time, Robert Finch, threatened to resign over this, and the matter was dropped for a while. However, the pressure continued to come from the White House, and Secretary Panetta did leave. I understand it was a race to see whether you would write your resignation first or they would get the order to fire you in first. I'm not sure how that came out. He went to work for John Lindsay, the mayor of New York City, which was a very exciting time in New York City for those of us who remember his administration, and subsequently practiced law for 5 years in California before being elected a member of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1976. Representing his Central Coast District in Congress for 16 years, Secretary Panetta became a respected leader on agricultural, federal budget, ocean affairs, hunger, and health care issues, and for 4 years chaired the House Budget Committee. Although he was elected to a 9th congressional term in 1992, President Clinton wanted his new administration to have a real policy and budget pro at the helm of the Office of Management and Budget. Panetta took the job of director and earned broad respect for his command of the budget issues and his leadership of the budget process. After 1.5 years at OMB, President Clinton asked him to serve as his chief of staff, which he did for the rest of Clinton's first term. It is widely reported that he brought order and focus to the White House and made a major contribution to the success of the administration. He played a key role in negotiating the 1996 budget, which brought the federal deficit down to approximately $100 billion, which was the lowest deficit in 14 years, and really set the stage for those balanced budgets that Secretary Burwell helped to produce during President Clinton's second term. So you've really been a team for a while. Upon leaving the Clinton administration in 1997, Secretary Panetta joined with his wife Sylvia to establish and co-direct the Panetta Institute for Public Policy, based at California State University, Monterey Bay. Reflecting the Secretary's ideals and personal example, the nonpartisan, not-for-profit Study Center seeks to attract thoughtful men and women to public service and prepare them for the policy challenges of the future. The Richardson Prize is united in purpose with the Panetta Institute, since the prize also aims to inspire young people to enter public service. Secretary Panetta himself returned to public service in 2009 at the start of the Obama administration as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He worked with the intelligence community and international leaders to combat the threats of Islamic extremism and the Taliban. He supported the use of drones against terrorists and supervised the operation that successfully found and brought Osama bin Laden to justice. After more than 2 years at the agency, President Obama nominated him to become the Secretary of Defense, replacing Bob Gates, who is also a recipient of the Richardson Prize. He was confirmed by a unanimous vote of the U.S. Senate and took office on July 1, 2011. He worked with the leadership of DoD to develop a new defense strategy and sought ways to keep the military strong in the face of budget cuts. He strengthened U.S. international alliances and took a hard line with Iran on the development of nuclear weapons. He also took measures to open military service opportunities to all Americans, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. For his superior performance in some of the nation's toughest jobs, and for his ongoing commitment to the next generation of public servants, Secretary Panetta richly deserves the Richardson Prize. We now have Michael Rogers, the chairman of the Richardson Prize Board, to present the awards.
Thank you, Joe. And Joe and JT have been kind of a team that came over from the Council for Excellence, and as we transitioned the Richardson Prize Fund into Napa. This is the 5th time, can you believe it, that this award has been presented under Napa. And each time, we've all come away saying what a great job the nominating committee did in nominating outstanding public leaders and public administrators for this prize, and this time is absolutely no exception. Let me acknowledge, we have some younger people in the audience tonight. President Burwell brought some students from American University. These are future public administrators and policy leaders, and we want to welcome you to this event. And so one of the great things about this award is it not only recognizes your life work and your accomplishments, it also happens to be one of the awards that puts a little money in your pocket. And it's a nice prize that comes with it, and we are always delighted to do that. And we also stipulated, that half of it goes to your favorite charity. You decide that. And I always say, Terry, for the Napa president, in behalf of the Napa president, and if that charity happens to be Napa, we would appreciate it. Sylvia Matthews Burwell, Senior White House staff member, global nonprofit leader, director of the Office of Management and Budget, Secretary of Health and Human Services, scholar, and educator. Sylvia Matthews Burwell has consistently advanced the public interest while exhibiting courage and integrity. A visionary leader, Mrs. Burwell combines a commitment of education and research with the ability to manage large and complex organizations to bring solutions to some of the world's most pressing challenges. Her youth and current role as president of American University in Washington, D.C., suggests the prospect for additional public service by this extraordinary accomplished woman who embodies the public service virtues of Elliot Richardson. Please join me as we present this award to you. Please have a seat on the far end of it. Leon Panetta, Army officer, civil rights advocate, congressman, director of the Office of Management and Budget, White House Chief of Staff, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Secretary of Defense, advocate for protection of ocean resources, scholar, and author. Leon Panetta has no rival as a public servant. He has contributed effectively in each of these critical roles of public policy and government management. Wide and long and courageous stewardship of the public interest by this forthright patriot distinguish him as an ideal recipient for the Elliot Richardson Prize for Excellence in Public Service. Mr. Secretary. And one of the delights of this event is the conversation that we ask our recipients to participate in after presentation. And we have been fortunate over the past 4 times to have great moderators, and tonight is no exception. George F. Will's newspaper column has been syndicated by the Washington Post since 1974. Today it appears twice weekly in 442 newspapers. In 1976, he became a regular contributing editor of Newsweek magazine, for which he provided a bi-monthly essay until 2011. In 1977, he won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in his newspaper columns. Altogether, 8 collections of Mr. Will's Newsweek and Washington Post columns have been published, the most recent being One Man's America, The Pleasures and Provocations of Our Singular Nation in 2008. Mr. Will has also published 3 books on political theory and several others on baseball. Mr. Will's most recently published A Nice Little Place on the North Side, Wrigley Field at 100. That was in 2014. In July 2000, Mr. Will was a member of the Major League Baseball's Blue Ribbon panel examining baseball economics. In 1981, Mr. Will became a founding panel member on ABC's This Week and spent over 3 decades providing regular commentary. Then followed 3 years with Fox News, where he appeared regularly on Special Report and Fox News Sunday. Mr. Will is now a regular contributor to MSNBC and NBC News. He was born in Champaign, Illinois, educated at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, Oxford University, and Princeton University, where he earned his PhD and currently serves as a trustee. He has taught political philosophy at Michigan State University, the University of Toronto, and Harvard University. Mr. Will served as a staff member of the United States Senate from 1970 to 72, and from 73 to 76, he was the Washington editor of the National Review magazine. Today, he lives in Washington and works in the Washington, D.C. area. We are delighted to have George Will lead our conversation this evening.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Will reminds me, because she knows I need to be reminded, that tomorrow is Valentine's Day, when 3 beautiful words will be heard around the country: I love you. But Tomorrow, the four most beautiful words in the English language will be heard: pitchers and catchers report. I mention this because Washington has a long and mostly inglorious baseball history. They were run for a long time by a man named Clark Griffith, who once said that fans like home runs, and we have assembled a pitching staff to please our fans. I mention that because we're here tonight to talk about excellence, which is not a word that springs to mind with most Americans when they think of the federal government. And I'd like to begin by asking about that. I don't want anyone talking politics here, but how issues intersect with public administration. It is a fact that for the last 40 years or so, as the government has become more ambitious, more ameliorative in its intentions, more compassionate and caring, its reputation has plummeted. Why?
So I think that the question of the reputation of government also needs to be viewed in the broader context of institutions, and whether that's religious institutions, the private sector, or all institutions. And I think as we think about government, we need to think about it in the broader context and what is causing that, and what percentage of that is performance, and what percentage of that is lack of trust. And where does that lack of trust come from in terms of the questions of performance? I think having served for a number of years in government, not nearly as many as Leon has, but the question of what one sees, and I think there are certainly places for improvement, and that is a part of the problem, but I think there are other issues. And a lot of that actually has to do with a lack of proximity to the substance of what government does. And I think one sees that in the context of, for instance, the shutdown. And when people realized that there were things that were not going to happen that the government does. And so I think a part of the problem has to do with the broader context of a lack of trust of institutions. I think part of the problem has to do with places where the government can and should function better. And I think part of the problem comes from a lack of understanding of the role that government plays in people's lives.
George, I tell the students at our institute that in our democracy we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If leadership is there and willing to take the risks associated with leadership, and make no mistake about it, if you're a leader, you've got to take risks. If you're willing to do that, then you can avoid, certainly control crisis. But if leadership is not there, then we will inevitably govern by crisis. And today, we govern by crisis. Members of Congress, administration, are unwilling to provide the leadership that is so necessary to be able to resolve the issues that confront this country for a lot of reasons. And so they rely on crisis, and having been in elective office, that's an easy way to survive. You don't have to make any tough decisions. You don't have to cut anybody's programs. You don't have to raise anybody's taxes. You just basically wait for crisis. And then when crisis gets so bad, you blame the crisis for having to do anything. And these days, what happens in Congress is when crisis happens, rather than even resolve the issue, they just kick the can down the road and hope that somehow the problem will pass on to others. You can do that, but there's a price to be paid. And the price is that you lose the trust of the American people in our system of governing. And I think we have seen that erosion of trust in government because leadership is not there and not willing to take the risks that are inherent in governing a democracy. And that I think is the legacy of these last few years that I think is really hurting the state of government and the respect for government by the American people.
President Burwell, you suggest that Americans have a shaky understanding of how the government works at the most basic level. That's got to be in part a fault of the media, which is fascinated by and comfortable writing about politics, the horse race of it, and less so about administration, which is dry as dust often, but matters. How would you improve this? How can you get the media more interested in something other than who's going to win the New Hampshire primary?
So I actually think the media has a responsibility, but I actually think the public has a responsibility too, in terms of what they demand and what they consume. And last summer, and I could do the test here, I asked a group, this is a group of people who follow things closely. Can you name the 3 countries that there were droughts in Africa this past summer? And if you ask that question versus some of the back and forth on politics, so you would answer what happened in the White House on that given period in terms of who was in, who was out, and that sort of thing. And so I think it's actually a combination of the two that I think media and our journalists respond to the demands. And so I think it's about both taking the step in terms of all of us, as we walk out, think about what it is you're reading in terms of the news and how you consume it and what your demand for it is. But at the same time, having folks focus on the substance of issues. Then I also think there's a third part, which is when you're in government or anywhere, helping journalists and others think about how the topic that is dry as dust sometimes can be more interesting and connect to real people's lives. So I think it's going to take a combination of the 3, those who are providing the news, those who are writing about the news, and those who are demanding the news, to make a difference.
This town is fundamentally dysfunctional. I've seen Washington at its best, and I've seen Washington at its worst. The good news is I've seen Washington work. George has seen it work. Sylvia's seen it work. The fact is there was a time when Republicans and Democrats were willing to sit down, work together, and try to resolve issues. Were there politics? Of course there were politics. There always will be politics. But they were willing to sit down and try to resolve issues. They were willing to govern the country. And there are a lot of reasons that we now have a Washington that doesn't want to govern. There's no silver bullet out there. Part of it is, I think gerrymandering process, which has created safe Republican seats and safe Democratic seats. So it forces members to the extremes rather than to the middle. And the middle is where you compromise and find consensus. There's money in politics. These guys are raising money every night now in order to run for office, not something that was done in my time. We usually raise money in the year you're running for election. And money plays a big role in politics. And the media plays a huge role. The media, the 24-hour news operation, they basically decided that they're going to take sides and play sides in the evening news rather than trying to look at people that are trying to work together, trying to govern. They're looking for the controversy. And that's why you've got trench warfare on Capitol Hill, and very frankly, you have trench warfare in the media. And somehow the media has got to decide, is it just going to present one particular viewpoint, whether it's right or whether it's left, or is it going to try to present both viewpoints in a civil conversation so that both sides can be heard by the American people, rather than having one network basically spout one viewpoint and another viewpoint. And the internet is basically reflective of that as well. So somehow I think the media has got to get back to promoting civil discourse, and they're the ones that can do it.
Let me offer a hypothesis for the two of you to comment on, and it is this, that for all the discord, and Lord knows there's abundance of that, what really threatens America is a consensus. And the consensus is broad as the Republic and deep as the Grand Canyon, shared by both parties. And it is that we should have a large, generous entitlement state and not pay for it. Everyone's agreed. Hence, this last week we have now planned with 4.1% unemployment and 3% growth to have 10-digit deficits coming up. Am I wrong that it's the consensus we have that's more alarming? I mean, you know that Admiral Mullen said that the biggest threat to our national security is the national deficit. You sat at the intersection of all the entitlement programs. which are not sustainable, pretty clearly, unless you assume 6% growth forever. Wonderful story is that two Americans walking down a country road, one's a normal American, the other's an economist, and a deluge starts. And the normal American says, we're going to get soaked. And the economist says, no, we'll just assume an umbrella. We've decided to assume rapid economic. Am I wrong to be more alarmed by the consensus than by the discord?
Well, in terms of, I think the disturbance of the lack of consideration of deficit issues, I think is the bigger issue. I think you, in your question and approach, are assuming a solution to that deficit approach, and I think that's a point for the kind of debate and conversation that we should have as a nation. I think what does disturb me, and Leon, I'm sure too, and CBO, Dan Griffin is here this evening, disturbs all of us, is this question of a lack of recognition and focus that deficits and our debt as a percentage of GDP are something, those are some things that we should consider. And we should consider them in the broader context of the rest of our policy making. And I think that has been absent. And I think it does get to the question of the dysfunctionality that Leon is referring to. When you have regular order, and for me, regular order is the use of hearings, the use of analysis, and the use of saying, here are the trade-offs, so that we can come to the point that you were making in terms of if you believe it is an entitlement issue, or what you believe in terms of what our revenues as a percentage of GDP should be, and our entitlement. That's, I think, fair conversation and the kind of conversation we have, but there's no place to have it when you get out of regular order and that dysfunctional nature. That is why there are committees. That is why there is expertise on the Hill that develops in that way. And so, yes, it is something that gives me great pause. I think the thing that gives me greater pause probably is this question of dysfunction and a movement away from regular order, which is the means by which we do everything from consider policies around our deficit to other policies that affect the entire nation.
President Burwell refers to expertise on the Hill. And, well, no, it's not an oxymoron yet, but it is the case, is it not, and you're a veteran of both branches now, that the Hill is somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of the government. I mean, there's still 435 members of Congress, House, and 100 senators, and the government keeps growing exponentially. Madison worried that the legislature would draw all power into its impetuous vortex. What we've really seen recently is Congress expelling powers, delegating to the executive branch, and provoking, in a way, the executive branch to govern by unilateral decrees. Is this solvable?
It's been very bipartisan, George.
Sure, absolutely.
It's been very bipartisan. Republicans have always spent money on their favorite programs and cut taxes without paying for them. That's always been their favorite. And the Democrats have increased entitlements and discretionary spending. Those are the Democrats' favorites. And so everybody right now is basically just charging ahead and without even paying any attention to what needs to be done. We've been through this. You know, maybe there are some people in this audience that remember what the hell we went through in the 1980s and 1990s. We were worried then about $300, $400, $500 billion deficits. And we thought the end of the world was coming in 2000 as a result of increasing deficits. And a guy named Ross Perot made that a campaign issue when he ran for president. And everybody was looking for the easy solution then. You know, they're looking for the easy solution now. Should we have a balanced budget amendment to somehow force, dealing with this? Shall we have the so-called legislative veto and give that to the president? There were all kinds of magic solutions. But the problem is there is no magic here. This is about tough nuts and bolts. if you're going to deal with the federal budget, you can't ignore entitlement programs. It's 2/3 of federal spending, for God's sakes. And so you're going to have to go in and reform entitlement programs and tighten up on the programs that are there. We did that when we had budget summits. We looked at putting limits on both defense and discretionary spending. We had caps, but those caps gradually increased over a period of time. And we raised taxes. We raised taxes. I mean, in the Bush administration, we did $250 billion in entitlement savings, and we did $250 billion in revenues, in taxes. And Bill Clinton, in his budget, basically repeated the same thing. And because of those agreements, that put us on a path towards a balanced budget. But those are tough decisions. Did members lose seats because of the votes on those measures? You're damn right. I'm sure there were members who had to vote for that, raise taxes, cut entitlements. You bet there are some that lost seats. But they did the right thing. That's missing right now. Nobody wants to deal with what you have to deal with if you're going to, in any way, control the deficit in the out years. What's missing is a comprehensive budget agreement between Republicans, Democrats, and the president. And if that doesn't happen, we will have a budget crisis because of this huge debt.
You dealt with what we'll all deal with almost exclusively, as far as I can tell, for the next 30 years, which is medicine. Largest employer in Pittsburgh is the University of Pittsburgh because of its medical center. Largest employer in Cleveland is the Cleveland Clinic. Second largest employer is another healthcare provider. 6 of the 10 largest employers in Ohio are healthcare providers. Largest employer in Houston, Texas hospital centers, same all across the country. And this is because of a tremendous social success, longevity. We have an aging population that's living inconveniently long. I'm not attacking the elderly, I am elderly. So if we stipulate, it seems to me it's simple arithmetic, that you cannot run the current entitlement state on 17% of GDP in federal revenues. You need more revenues, you need less rich entitlement menu, or some combination of the two. How do we cope with this? Because it's impossible to have a calm political conversation about restructuring the federal provision of medicine.
It is very difficult. I can attest to that, to have any conversation around health or healthcare in our nation that is civil. But I actually think it is what Leon said in terms of getting to the place where we make the tough decisions. And so let's look at entitlements. The big part of entitlements is Medicare. Medicare and Medicaid is a portion of that, but the states bear a lot of Medicaid. So Medicare, when one looks at the numbers, the budget was $1.1 trillion when I left HHS, and the vast majority of that was in the form of Medicare. And I actually think it is part of a larger issue, which is the cost of health care in the United States. And so as we think about how to go about the overarching issue, I think, as Leon said, the times that he described, when we do it as a package, and you have to bring all the pieces together. We have done discretionary on its own for many years. To your point, we haven't done entitlements. When we look at it together. With regard to the place where I see hope, in terms of a very difficult and challenging situation, I think most people don't realize that in the period from 2010 to about the end of 2009 through 2014 or 15, Medicare spending was $473 billion less than was projected. Those are big numbers, especially when you consider the deal that Leon was talking about. And so I think there are ways and approaches to think about that, but you have to do it in the context of a bigger deal. There are fundamental things that we as a nation need to do on the Medicare side, but we need to do it through all of health care. Because when you think about this issue of health care, 150 million people have employer-based insurance. So the vast majority of our country is paying employer-based insurance. Then, the numbers are basically another 50 for Medicare, around there, another 50, 60 for Medicaid in terms of it. And then you have a very small portion that's in the individual market, which is what the whole conversation was about. So this is something that cuts across. And how we need to get there, I believe, is something that I talked about a lot when I was secretary called delivery system reform. And it is about focusing on access, affordability, and quality with a heavy emphasis on affordability and access. And we need to change some things about our healthcare system for all parts, Medicare included. Medicare will lead because it's a big payer. And the other thing is, put this in context. Private pays the most, Medicare pays the next, Medicaid pays the least in terms of services and cost per capita services. And so as you think about trying to fix the problem, you have to fix it across. Delivery system reform, 3 fundamental things. The first is we have to change the way we pay. In our system in the United States today, we pay fee for service. We pay for quantity, not quality of outcome. We need to do that. We committed, when I was there, that 30% of Medicare payments would be in alternative payment models that do this shift by 2016 when we left, and by 2018, 50%. We'll see if they get there. Second, you got to change the way you deliver care. What does that mean? 2 things. We need more integrated care where care providers work with each other. Think about a hip replacement and think about the fact that the person who's giving you your anesthesia actually understands what the person who's your physical therapist does, and you work as a team and you're paid for that episode of care. The second part of changing the way we deliver care has to do with prevention and wellness. The third thing is the use of the data and information. Electronic health records right now frustrate doctors. They frustrate patients. We do not get the value. That's my short version.
But that's Sylvia's exactly right, and she's pointed out the areas where you can find savings and deliver good health care. But when you're dealing with $1 trillion deficit, which is what we're going to have next year, maybe even earlier, you've got to go after all of the entitlements. If you just try to target Medicare or Medicaid, you're going to run into political problems. But if you really go after all of the entitlements, as we did, then I think that's the way you can try to get this through. I mean, look, there are other entitlements that need reforms. We do agricultural support prices. Well, in the budget deal we did, we began to limit how much you're going to pay for agricultural support prices. So farmers had to contribute. We went after veterans' health care. There were a lot of issues where same kind of issues. How can you try to improve veterans' health care? We went after the whole issue of, obviously, Medicare and Medicaid. We're part of that package as well. So what we did was we went after all of the entitlements, the exception of Social Security, which we did as part of the commission report and got that through on that basis. But you've got to include all of these areas. And the reason I tell you that is because when I was asked, by people who opposed raising taxes, I said, well, wait a minute. We've got a national problem here. The farmers are contributing to it. The veterans are contributing to it. Senior citizens are contributing to it. People on Medicaid are contributing to it. Why the hell can't you contribute to it, in terms of the taxes that are being raised? And there's no answer to that. If we come together, we can get this done.
So you seem to be saying that what we need is make everyone mad at once.
Sacrifice.
Yeah.
Sacrifice.
Pick
something that's not used anymore.
Yeah. I mean, because when they tried to change to a change CPI, a minor change in how we calculate the cost of living couldn't get it done. So you're avoid these skirmishes, have nuclear wars. You got to put the whole deal together. Let me. I brought a little show and tell here. This bad boy is, you've all heard of it, you've never seen it. This is the Gang of Eight Senate Immigration Bill of 2013. It's comprehensive, to use the word we like, comprehensive health care. 1,197 pages long. Has to be that long, Leon, because the senators know everything. And well, it's comprehensive, so you laugh. Do you know what the proper 2016 hourly wage of an immigrant animal sorter is? It's all in here. It's $9.84, which is 20 cents more than the proper wage for an immigrant nursery worker, which is also in here. This is what comprehensive looks like. This unimpressive little thing, Homestead Act of 1862, one of the half-dozen most important laws ever passed by Congress. To be fair, the parchment copy in the archives is 4 pages long, 1,193 pages shorter than this. My way of posing the question to both of you, you've dealt with comprehensive health care reform. You want comprehensive budget reform. We don't do comprehensive well, do we?
Frankly, they don't do anything well right now. Yeah. I'll take some kind of comprehensive effort. No, I mean, look, that's true. I remember when we did one of the budget deals, and we had to do it. It was when George Bush was president, and we had gone out to Andrews Air Force Base, and at Andrews Air Force Base, we not only were there, we cut the deal, but then when we brought it to the Congress, we wanted to do not only the budget, we wanted to do reconciliation, and we wanted to do all of the appropriations at one time. And so they brought that bill on the floor in a wheelbarrow. It's true. Yeah. They brought it on the floor in a wheelbarrow. And, a lot of people were making fun about that and what have you. But we were able to get it passed. And it was bipartisan, by the way. Republicans and Democrats worked together and got that passed. It is part of the problem today is that because everybody's fighting, because they're in trench warfare, because they're in a partisan divide, they are not coming together to do the kind of overview of federal programs that they should be doing. Because the reality is that the government can be reduced in an effective way. Doesn't mean, it has to be scalded or cut across the board. But if you look at programs, and we did that at OMB, my God, you can't tell me that you can't find savings in the federal budget. You can. But it takes hard work. It takes both sides working together to be able to get that done. And we haven't even begun to get to where we need to be in terms of being able to deliver on governing the country. That's the problem.
In your purview at Health and Human Services, part of the problem you were dealing with is that the government, we began to build an entitlement state, a welfare state, with Social Security in 1935. Today, the entitlement state exists to subsidize two things that did not exist in 1935, protracted retirement and competent medicine. In 1935, in the 20th century, the average retirement extended from 2 years to 20 years. 1935, retirement was a luxury of a tiny sliver of the American people. They worked until they couldn't work any longer and died shortly thereafter. Medicine, I was born in a hospital in 1941 when, in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, university town, good hospitals, in which I'm sure, because my dear best friend Pat Moynihan told me it was true of almost all hospitals back then, the principal expense of the hospital was clean linen. Before MRIs and CAT scans and electron microscopes and laser surgery and all the rest. Calvin Coolidge, last president with whom I fully agreed, his son in 1925 played tennis without socks. He got a blister, it got infected, and he died a lingering death in the White House because there was almost nothing anyone could do, even for the president's children. Medicine was not competent. Long story short, we're going to keep living longer. We're going to have more and more competent medicine. We're going to have more and more discretionary income to spend on competent medicine. This is a story of ruinous success. Longevity and a great science, this wonderful dynamic science of American medicine. How do you get through to breaking the cost spiral that you're worried about?
So I think one needs to go ahead and say, do you accept, did you want Coolidge's son to be saved? Do you want your MRI? Are we going to accept that we want the advances? And so I think most people, I think we have to start with the question, and once one says yes, then figuring out how to go about approaching that. And I actually think there are a couple of things that come to mind very specifically that one can do at the front end. And one, which was very controversial, actually is the conversation about how we as a nation treat the last part of life. And it is not I'm going to talk about something that's uncomfortable to talk about. And that's why we don't talk about it. And it is one of the things that drives cost. When I arrived at HHS, remember, I had not been there for a lot. I was in Seattle and Arkansas for the first 4 years. And so I'd missed a lot of the debate and everything. But there was one particular issue that struck me that at HHS we should do. And we should pay doctors to have that conversation, so that everybody in this room has it written down. What do you want to do so that your family has the guidance, so that you have been in control of how you want that end to be and how we go about doing that? Well, I was told, do you not remember death panels? Do you not remember anything like that? And I said, well, but I still believe it can be okay and we need to do it. It's a very important part to get to part of the solution. And so we did. We went forward. And none of you probably actually even know that, now Medicare will pay for that consultation. And the way we did it was in a bipartisan fashion. I will say, Congressman Phil Rowe, thank you, because I was able to work. So that's one place, is how do we think about that end of life, which is a very expensive part, and how do we face up to it as a culture in terms of our willingness to talk about that part of it. The second thing is, as we as a nation advance, we're going to have more individualized medicine. And the question is that going to make it more costly or less costly as we go? And individualized medicine is going to have two branches to it. The first one is scientific. And so your liver cancer isn't about the liver, it's about your cancer. And we will get to the place where we understand your cancer, as it is genetically driven and driven by the environmental things and how you've led your life. And we'll be able to treat it better. But precision medicine on the science side, and then individualized medicine because of the reforms that I described, where you are at the center of your care. And so as we work through those things, those are some of the ways that we're going to have to get in front of the costs that you're talking about. The prevention and wellness elements, extremely important to how we think about these long-term costs. And then, this, as I said, the other part is that end-of-life part.
As an enormous part of our health care bill is voluntary, in that it's the result of known risky behavior.
Right now in our country today, this year, 500,000 people will die preventable deaths from tobacco on an annual basis.
Type 2 diabetes, violence, vehicular accidents,
so
coronary heart
type
disease.
2 diabetes. This is where we need to make the progress. There is something called the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Innovation. Because Medicare is very expensive, you can't just play around and try things. So this was part of what the Act created, was a space where you could try and model solutions. In terms of type 2 diabetes, we were allowed to join with the YMCA. We could never partner with the YMCA. They're not doctors. But we did partner with the YMCA, and they did a program in terms of prevention for type 2 diabetes. In 15 months, the average savings was $2,600, and the drop in weight, these are all pre-diabetics, so they're people who are on their path to becoming type 2 diabetics, 5% weight loss. Now we need to work to scale. But these are the kinds of things we need to do, and it's what Leon said. This is hard work. This is not easy. Doesn't just happen. And so the patience, the support, and the willingness to go forward and do those things are the way we're going to have to go piece by piece at this kind of issue of longer life.
I mean, look, the big problem is that politically nobody wants to tell the American people that they have to sacrifice. And as a result of that, young people have tremendous expectations. Old people have tremendous expectations. Everybody wants everything. And look, we went to war in 9/11 and never, for the first time in history, paid for that war. The President of the United States did not say, we're going to war, we need to raise taxes to pay for that war, which is something I think the American people would have been willing to do. But nobody asked that.
And simultaneously, we passed an unfunded new entitlement.
Yeah,
Medicare
a Medicare
Part D.
entitlement
Part
was
D.
passed that wasn't
Yes.
paid for. I mean, look, right now, for God's sakes, infrastructure, everybody, Democrats, Republicans, everybody knows we've got to improve our infrastructure in this country. But they can't, for the life of them, decide that maybe the gas tax, which was always the source for funding infrastructure in this country, maybe we could increase that, 15, 20 cents. The Chamber of Commerce, for crying out loud, said we should increase it.
The American
20 cents.
Trucking Association.
The Trucking Association says we ought to increase it. But it's like anathema.
Let me ask you about infrastructure for a minute. I've written 5,500 columns, and only one of them has had any effect, so far as I can tell.
Which one?
I will tell you. I wrote a column about the problem with the Charleston Harbor, Charleston, Jacksonville, Savannah, not deep enough. They need dredge, moving mud. This is not complicated to deal with the larger ships coming through the widened Panama Canal. So I wrote a column saying the Army says, the Army Corps of Engineers say they could dredge the harbor in 10 years. Now, the president in State of the Union says, my God, we built the Empire State Building in 410 days during the Depression. We built the Pentagon in 16 months during war, 10 years to move the mud. So Obama reads this, he calls Lindsey Graham and says, something ought to be done. They got it dredged. Anyway, 40 years as a columnist, that's it. But anyway, can government, we're here to talk about public administration. Can the government get out of its own way? I mean, why did we used to be able to get things done? My friend Pat Moynihan said we used to be a country that celebrated people who got things done. Now we celebrate people who stop things from getting done. Can government get out of its own way in public administration to get these projects done?
Yeah, I have always been very optimistic about the ability to try to fix the problems that are out there. But the missing ingredient really is leadership. I mean, people say, okay, what about reforms? What about doing this? What about doing that? Reforms in and of themselves don't work without leadership. It really does take fundamental leadership. President of the United States has to be willing to say to the leadership, both Republicans and Democrats, as this president has said a few times, but then not followed through. If you're willing to sit down in a room, and I've been there, I mean, on the budget agreements, Ronald Reagan wanted to do a budget agreement. The leadership, Tip O'Neill, Bob Dole, put us in a room and said, you're not coming out of that damn room till you have a deal. And we did it because we knew the leadership supported it and the President of the United States supported it. We did it. I mean, unless this president is willing to push that kind of effort, we'll never get ahead of this. We'll be always falling behind. And so at some point, and very frankly, look, it's probably not going to happen with this president. If another president comes in and tries to do the right thing, that president will probably be a one-term president. Because if you're going to do the right thing, frankly, you're going to have to get your own party mad at you. I mean, if it's a Democrat, Democrats are going to be angry about entitlement savings, about other things that will be done. Republicans, if it's a Republican, they'll be angry if a president tries to raise revenues of any kind. And so that president's going to have to anger the extremes of the party. And it may cost him the election. He or she may cost him the election. But you know what? That's okay. That's what leadership's all about. I remember George Bush, when he moved his lips and we finally got the budget agreement done. And I remember talking to him, and I said, Mr. President, I know this is tough, but you made the right decision. And he said, yeah, but boy, it's going to be politically, it's going to come back to haunt me. And then he backed away from the budget agreement when he ran for president. And I remember seeing him, I think it was a couple of years ago, and I said, Mr. President, you shouldn't have apologized for that because you did the right thing. And I know politically it was difficult, but you know what? It was the right thing to do. And somehow we've got to get back to the right thing to do. This is not, you aren't elected just to save your rear end in Congress or in the Senate. You're elected to make tough decisions. And somehow we've got to get back to that in order to deal with the challenges we've been talking about.
You're both talking about leadership and candor with the American people and all the rest. Is there a structural reform that if you had a magic wand and could say, I can wave the wand and make this structural reform happen to our government that would improve things? Do you have one?
I have one that I think would help I would think about on the executive branch side. The structural reform to fix the Congress, I will struggle a little bit there.
I'll tell him that in a second.
Good.
Go ahead.
In terms of things that I think would make a fundamental difference, I'll give you a macro one and a micro one that I think would make a difference in the kinds of things you're talking about in terms of the function, the length, those things. I actually think we have to focus on personnel in the federal government. And I see here so many friends and colleagues that I worked with at OMB and the career civil servants, that whether it was when I was at OMB, Treasury, HHS, have had the opportunity. But we need help there, and we need help in everything from the hiring and that process by which we hire, the process by which we support and train, and the process by which we retain folks that are coming into government. Because on a day-to-day basis, when you talked about the frustrations of the American people, they think DMV, right? And that is the interaction that they're having with individuals. And what I just so firmly believe and saw, we need to have strong people on a day-to-day basis who are executing, because that's what people get frustrated with. Is you're frustrated when the execution, you're like, I'm just trying to get my Medicare worked out, or whatever it is. And so high-quality people, and I also believe it has to do with hiring. People need to take accountability and responsibility for whom they hire. And so this whole area of personnel, and then I would put there, it's smaller, but it is the political appointees and the entire confirmation process in terms of getting people in positions to do their job. The micro one that I would mention in terms of trying to get us to a better place, I'll just say at HHS, at the Department of Health and Human Services, and you heard our budget, it's large, 78,000 people, and there are no undersecretaries. There are undersecretaries at the Department of Education, a much smaller department. There are no undersecretaries. And so what that creates from a management perspective and a management structure isn't really the way you want to run a railroad. But you would have to do it legislatively. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very difficult thing to get done. Secretary Thompson and Secretary Shalala, Republicans and Democrats, come together. We say it needs to be done. If you're a former HHS secretary, we all say the same thing, but very difficult to do. So one is macro, micro.
Yeah. President Burwell says sensibly we need talent, and we need to get the talent into government.
Yes.
Actually fill the offices. You say we need courage, leadership, make your own party mad. Wouldn't term limits help?
We tried that in California, and it didn't work very well. Because, the idea was, okay, we'll put term limits on, and, we'll really create a citizen representative body. And these people will go to Sacramento, they'll serve for their period of time, and then they'll go back home and become businessmen and community leaders, et cetera. Baloney. What they did was they go there for their 2 terms in the assembly and immediately be looking to run for the Senate, which was a 2 or 3 term limit. And then if not that, for Congress. They were always running for something. And in the meantime, you lost seniority, you lost leadership, you lost people who understand, the Willie Browns of the world, who kind of understood how to put pieces together and get it through. That was all lost. We ran through something like 6 or 7 speakers in a matter of a few years. So I could see putting some large limitation on it, but I don't think term limits in and of themselves are going to solve the problem. What you've got to do, I mean, there are several things. You've got to be able to do what we did in California. Two things. We have a commission that does gerrymandering. It's not done in the legislature. It's done by a commission. And the result is we are electing more members closer to the middle. We combine that with the open primary. These were initiatives in California. The open primary is, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you vote for the best candidate. That tends to be not the extreme candidate, the candidate that's closer to the center. And so I think those kinds of reforms, I think, can be more meaningful in trying to develop representation that is closer to where the American people can be truly represented.
In the introductory remarks, referring to Elliot Richardson, to his obvious interest in the Saturday Night Massacre, which I remember vividly, did either of you have a moment when you were in public administration when you had a genuinely ethical dilemma that you had to cope with?
Well, it was mentioned. I went to work. I had worked for Tom Kuechel, a Republican from California, who was defeated by Max Rafferty at the time. And so I kind of looked for, am I going to go back to California? Am I going to stay here? And Bob Finch asked me to come down to HEW. And immediately, I had worked on civil rights legislation in the Senate, asked me to become a director of the Office for Civil Rights, which I did, enforcing the law, particularly focused on the South at that time, and districts that had been racially divided for a couple hundred years. And so the job was to basically go in and try to desegregate districts and try to hopefully improve equal education for all children. And the South, I have to say, there were tremendous leaders who were willing to do it, and they provided great leadership. Nixon had cut the deal in his election with the Southern strategy. He was running against Rockefeller. And in order to get the South to support him, basically said we're going to back off of some of the tough civil rights enforcement. And so I become director of the Office for Civil Rights. I raise my hand to enforce the law, and I run right into the middle of a political storm in which the South kept coming up and saying, wait a minute, he cut a deal. He said you aren't going to do this anymore. And I said, yeah, but it's the law of the land. I've got to enforce the law. And I tried to work with people and tried to get the administration to understand that we were obligated to enforce the law. Well, obviously the political pressure was to back off. And I had to make that fundamental decision for the young people that are here. Fundamental decision is whether you stand by your conscience and do what you believe is right, or do you try to advance your career in government by modifying whatever your conscience tells you is right. I mean, those are some of the dividing decisions that you have to make. Elliot Richardson had to make that kind of decision. I made the decision I was going to continue to enforce the law as I thought it was right. And what happened, somebody talked a little bit about this, I woke up one morning, and in the Washington Post there was an article that said, Panetta has resigned. Truth. Yeah. And so I went downtown and saw Bob Finch, and I said, Bob, there had been rumors that I was going to resign. I said, there's an article that I resigned, and he said, no, just deny it. It's just some of the rumors that are going on. Well, they have the presidential press conference like we see every day now, and Ron Ziegler was asked the question, what about this story that Panetta resigned? He said, yes, he has. So I wrote my resignation letter, and that was it. But I have never, it's tough. It's a tough decision to make when you're doing that. I had a family, I had 2 kids, I was expecting a third. And, suddenly You have to make a decision that impacts on your personal life. But I've never regretted that decision. As tough as it was, I've never regretted it because I think ultimately it was the right thing to do. And ultimately, if you look at the Alabama football teams, if you look at the Auburn football teams, you know that equal education has advanced a lot in those areas.
The best sign of the progress we've made in the last 50 years is an Alabama-Auburn football game in which the head referee is an African American and he's bossing everyone around. Absolutely wonderful. Can you think of an ethic, not something quite as dramatic as this, but a genuinely ethical dilemma in public administration?
Certainly nothing. I've been fortunate that I haven't faced anything as dramatic as what Elliot Richardson faced or what, Leon, you faced in that situation. But, as I think about it, there are tough decisions, and most days those are tough decisions on policy. Should we have more night vision goggles or early Head Start, those kinds of decisions. But there are times, and the time that I would reflect on was actually during the shutdown. So the shutdown is an unnatural state, obviously, and the laws around, the laws are not designed for that in terms of the questions of criminal activity in terms of unappropriated funds. And so you're facing, minute by minute, you're facing decisions and kind of an ethical dilemma at one point was the fact that when the government is shut down, we actually fund the military. But if there is a military death, usually you pay for the family and the body, and those parts get paid for by the federal government. But there were no appropriated funds. And so the law when someone dies. And so are you going to enforce the law, or are you going to help that family whose son or daughter just died defending our country? And then, you start to do problem solving very quickly, which is, okay, fine. Can we just call somebody and have them pay for it? But then there's this law about supplementing appropriations, and there are laws and there are reasons you can understand as you start to work through why all the laws are the same. Fortunately, it didn't come to that situation because actually this is a place where the Congress did act. During the shutdown, during that period of the shutdown, we got the legislation passed to do it, to fix the problem. Yeah. Because it was a very real problem. It was a legal problem. Either you're going to obey the law or do what most people would consider what was right by families who had given up a child to defend our country.
We're standing between this group and strong drink. But we have microphones set up. Why don't we do we have time here for some questions? Step forward if you have any. Stunned silence.
I'll take a crack. What do the panelists or Mr. Will have to say to the idea that it's unlimited money in political campaigns and what that has done to party structure, party discipline in the Congress that has brought us to this rather terrible pass?
When I first ran for office in 1976, I think I spent about $180,000 on my election. My youngest son just ran for my seat successfully, thank God. And he raised close to $2 million. That's what's happening now. When I first got elected, it's true. When I first got elected, I didn't raise any money in the year that I used to spend 1 year really working at the job, working at the committees and working on legislation and really enjoying that. And then the next year, your election year, is when I began to raise money. And most of my money was raised in the district, with little fundraisers throughout the Central Coast of California. That's how we raised the money. Now, as a lot of people here know, they're raising money every night. up here with receptions of one kind or another. And it's not your little mom and pop that shows up. It's all of your, corporations and businesses and PACs of one kind or another who all go in with the $5,000 check and make sure the guy, whoever's running, knows that they were there, handed the check to them, and they're out. They're doing that every night. Every night. And so that has a tremendous impact. There's no question in my mind it's having a tremendous impact in terms of their unwillingness to take on tough issues, because most of those interests don't want to take on tough issues. And so that builds in some of the constrictions. How do you fix that? I think states are going to have to do this on its own. Congress is not going to do it. There was a time when Mo Udall, to his credit, was working on legislation to try to see if we could develop some kind of matching system. That never went anywhere. There are states that are doing this on their own. Maine, I guess, has done it. A few others are doing it. I think we're going to have to provide, some kind of system that limits the amount that can be spent and tries to provide some kind of match. Because otherwise, the buying and selling that goes on in this town really does undermine the ability of members to really represent the interests of their district.
I think happily President Burwell's not been involved in that. So let's take another question.
Yes, I like to thank the panel for discussion, excellent discussion. But my question is, on the government becoming too ambitious, what causes to be ambitious, and what caused both political parties to not talk about the issue? Is it because of money? Is it because of special interests and so forth?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
So in terms of why political parties aren't focused on the substance of the issues, I think that there are a number of reasons. I think the money is a part in terms of, I think, what Leon was reflecting, that the money is a distraction in a number of ways, both in terms of the time it takes to raise it. Mm-hmm. I think it is also being driven, we talked a little earlier about the media, and what people want to read and hear about, and people's interests, that, the question of, is this entertainment or is this substance? I think, as I said, I believe a return to regular order, which means using committees and the processes and structures that were set up that drive people to have substantive conversations, an important factor. And the other thing, I think, is respecting those entities like, whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Congressional Budget Office, and making sure that those entities that are independent and do analysis are respected.
It's trench warfare up there, and both parties are in their trenches, and it really is World War I. I mean, they don't want to go. They don't even want to go into no man's land to try to see if they can do it, and they fight over a few inches of territory and kill each other over a few inches of territory, because it's all about whether or not they can beat up the other side. This is about, you've got a thin margin of power, and now the parties are much more aimed at that margin of power. Mm-hmm. That's what drives them. To the point that, I was asking Jimmy, my youngest son, when the health care issue came up earlier this year, mm-hmm. I said, well, Jim, what's the Democratic position on health care? He says, we don't have one. When tax reform came up, I said, what's the Democratic position on tax reform? We don't have one. Well, for God's sakes, if you're a party and you want to reach out to the American people, you have to have a position. And if you're afraid to take a position because you're going to offend somebody, or you're going to offend, one part of your own party, then we'll never get to the issues. We'll never get to the issues, mm-hmm. because it'll be all about beating up the other side. And that's what's happening today. It isn't about governing. It's about, can you stop or beat up the other side?
Yeah, thank you.
My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation and congratulations on your awards. And I would like you to extend your leadership. Currently, the system is rigged, elections are rigged, and fundraising is really not necessary. We can change the system around. We cannot just take for granted that the current system is working. Current system is totally disruption about your democracy and about our progress. So if you can follow your leadership and change things around, currently like health care, like social program, those are supposed to benefit those targeted population, but actually it's not. Actually it's benefit to some corrupted people. And if you say employment is not really for production, a lot of employment is really negative productivity. And if you say that the accountability of budget, and that's really not accountable because the data is rigged to begin with. So I just wonder if you can change things around, not just follow the system. You have to change the system.
Is there a question here?
Yeah. So my question is extend your leadership and to try to look into at least look into the people's complaint or court file. Those are destroyed or suppressed or witnessed or maybe destroy their life. So if you can just change the system around, your leadership extension rather than just follow the system, and award is good, but important is how are you going to change the public interest?
I'm afraid changing the system will have to wait till we drain the swamp, and it's not going well. So.
No, we have to change it.
Nobody wants to drain the swamp.
Exactly. We are the swamp. Thank you. Please.
I wanted to ask your opinion on how we might fix the appropriations process. We submit a president's budget each year. Every federal agency does, like we did this past Monday. Most of the time it's dead on arrival. And then federal agencies continue to be held hostage each year under more and more continuing resolutions. And it just seems like the appropriations process, while never seemed to work to begin with, is gotten more and more out of whack. So what would you suggest, or do you see any sort of structural or permanent fix? I know some people say a 2-year appropriation cycle, some say bring back earmarks. Do you have any insight?
Yeah, no, look, the budget process is broken. Sylvia knows this, and it's a fact. It's broken. When I was elected in '76, it was a few years after the Budget Act was passed, and it was a bipartisan implementation. The budget committees were created on the House and Senate side. They really worked together on the budgets. It was a budget resolution. They met the deadlines for the budget resolution. The budget resolution establishes the targets for appropriations. Those targets were given to the Appropriations Committee, and the Appropriations Committee relished the opportunity to pass their individual appropriations bills. I mean, most of the chairmen and ranking members wanted to pass their appropriations bills. They didn't want to be part of a CR. They wanted to have the ability to work with their appropriations bills. And frankly, I think it was the last time, I think I was chief of staff at the time, we actually passed all of the appropriations bills by October 1. Mm-hmm. That hasn't happened in more than 25 years. Unless the leadership says we have got to do this, we're going to pass a budget resolution, and we're going to pass it by April, which is what they should do, and then implement the appropriations process where all individual appropriations bills come through, and really enforce that. And very frankly, the leadership can enforce it. In the House side, it certainly can be enforced. Senate side, it's a little tougher, but if the House did it, the Senate would do it. So you really need to have the leadership basically say, we've got to go back to enforcing the budget process as it was. And if that doesn't happen, then you will see the CR game replicated almost every year.
Let's let President Burwell, who's called for a return to regular order, address this, and then I will solve the problem in 30 seconds.
I agree with Leon. It will take the leadership to do it. The problem we have now is that the deadlines are not deadlines. The idea that we have this many CRs, and I think that there is a lack. This is a place where you asked about media. The reporting on what it's like to run a department without a budget, what it wastes in terms of money. You want us to, you want, the executive branch to function better? Well, tell us how much we have. How many times did I talk to the leadership of the Pentagon, the chiefs, and they just said, just give me certainty. I'd rather have less money and certainty so I can run my, it is like a business. They're trying. But so we need greater understanding of how incredibly damaging a CR is to the basic functioning efficiency, saving money to work against the deficit. And the leadership are the combination of things that I think we could use. And I might speak at another time to earmarks, and I actually believe it is part of what would help. I believe you contain it. Even as an OMB director, I believe what you do is you set up this amount of money and you give it to the leadership on a prorated basis and you say, it is yours. There are a minimal number of standards that it has to meet and no more. And that's the way you do it to help the process along.
Or you can apply the Warren Buffett principle. Warren Buffett's solution to the budget deficit is a constitutional amendment that says whenever the budget deficit is more than 2% of GDP, no sitting legislature is eligible to run for re-election.
I like
be
that.
done in 5 minutes, trust me. And same with the appropriations process. If
Thank
the
you.
12 cardinals, if they did not get the appropriations done, the whole Congress has to retire. They'd get it done.
You damn right they would.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Please.
In the 90s, David Osborne unveiled the Reinventing Government. And I was present at that meeting. NAPA, in fact, sponsored that briefing. And my boss at the time was John Kincaid of the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. And he asked the most pithy question. I think it's one that is well worth revisiting here. He said to David Osborne in the Q&A, he said, what does the report say, or what did your group come up with when you considered the mission of government? And David Osborne's response was, well, we didn't. And we're going to look at that later. Well, that's key. Some would say that the preamble of the Constitution is the mission statement of the government, and that embodies the whole notion of what is in public good and what is acting in the public interest. And I wanted to throw that out because I think that's where we are in the dilemma we are now, because people in government have forgotten that we don't have a common sense of mission. And as Mary Parker Follett would say, you need that invisible leader. You need that common sense of mission, common sense of purpose, and that is not what we have at the present time in the quantity that we needed.
I'll take whatever the hell would get them to do the job. I mean, it's a question of getting them to do it. And, the problem right now is they can't agree on the time of day. And to get them to try to agree on what the mission is for a particular purpose is going to be, I just want them to get to work. And Sylvia mentioned this. Regular order does work. It does work. I mean, I served on committees. And in a committee, when you're assigned a bill, and it goes to the subcommittee first, the subcommittee has hearings. They do a markup. Republicans and Democrats offer amendments. And what comes out of that is a product that in many ways represents consensus. It goes to the full committee. You do the same thing. You have amendments. Republicans, Democrats. The bill could be modified significantly. But it then goes to the Rules Committee and then to the floor where members have the opportunity to be able to offer amendments. And that's the product of representatives working within this regular order process. And that's why, I mean, now you talk about a health care bill, and they don't want to go through regular order. They don't want to do hearings, don't want to do amendments, don't want to take it through the committee process. They want somebody on high to get in a room with 5 people and cut a deal. That's how they legislate. And it blows up on them. The health care bill blew up on them. You know, tax reform was done that way, but the Republicans figured, you know, we got to pass something. And that wasn't done through regular order. It was done because a few people got together and said, this is the bill. That is not regular order. And that doesn't represent what our forefathers wanted the process to look like. So somehow we have got to get back to that process because, you know what? It does work. I don't understand why Ryan, I do think Mitch McConnell is doing that with the DACA bill. In the very least, they're sitting there, they're debating the issue. You know, all sides are being able to speak with one another. That's the way it's supposed to work. And the House, you know, for the Speaker, it would be a relief to have the committees do that. I saw Tip O'Neill work with committee chairmen, whether it was Rostenkowski or John Dingell or some of these guys who are tough old guys. But he was willing, he said, you work on the legislation. And they did. And they got it done. So somehow we've got to get it back to that process because the way they're doing it now is not the way it was supposed to work.
Well, to end on as close as I can come to a cheerful note, I would remind you of what Winston Churchill supposedly said he didn't, but he should have. He loved this country as much as he loved his American mother, and he said the American people invariably do the right thing after they have exhausted all the alternatives. And we're fairly far down the list. That's the cheerful news. Thank you very much.
All right, we certainly want to thank our panelists and our honorees for their insight and their candor, but there's one more thing that we have to do before we wrap up. And so, Anne, if you would join me, please. Many of you know that the National Academy of Public Administration has over 850 distinguished fellows, but we also have 16 honorary fellows. And at this time, we would like to present certificates of honorary fellowship to both President Burwell and Secretary Panetta. Thank you. Thank you. And we also have an Academy pin for you. Thank you. As our secretary. Thank you so much.
There's a lovely reception waiting for us, so I will be brief. Thank you all for coming tonight. Let's join together and again congratulate Mr. Panetta and Ms. Burwell for their service that inspires and uplifts, and for a wonderful conversation tonight with Mr. Will as well. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.